December 16, 1944, just 2 months after D-Day and the liberation of Western Europe from Nazi Germany's iron grip is at its zenith. Allied soldiers are poised for an all-out assault against Hitler's crumbling war machine. In the West, British and Canadian troops are readying themselves to punch through the enemy lines and advance towards Germany. Meanwhile, the American forces stationed in the Ardennes forest are preparing for what will be known as one of the deadliest battles of World War II. This is the Battle of the Bulge. And now back to the video. As with most military operations, the success or failure of Operation Watch on the Rhine hinges upon secrecy. And while thousands of men prepare for the battle, they must ensure their plans remain hidden from prying German eyes. With only light cover provided by a few artillery batteries, thousands of Allied troops spend days marching through muddy, snow-filled terrain. To add to this, some units are woefully under-equipped for winter warfare. But orders are orders. And despite the biting cold, men trudge forward into the heart of the forest. By December, the Allies have amassed an army of more than 85,000 men, supported by almost 3,000 vehicles and nearly 200 tanks. Their goal: breach the enemy's heavily fortified defenses and establish a bridgehead over the River Earth. From here, they can then advance inland, splitting the German forces into and hastening their defeat once and for all. The plan seems foolproof. But hidden deep within the trees, a pair of German soldiers huddled around a crackling fire, sipping mugs of steaming hot chocolate. One of them, a young conscript named Joseph, appeared nervous. "Are you sure about this, Franz? It all sounds a bit mad." "Don't be a fool, Joseph," Franz replied, taking another swig of his drink. "The Americans are coming. We just need to stop them." Franz was right. After several weeks of relative quiet, the Germans had launched a surprise attack, pushing the Americans back across the river. While the Allies regrouped, Franz and Joseph's unit dug into the forest's thick undergrowth, turning the tangled mess of trees and shrubs into a near impenetrable defense. Here, they would wait for the Americans to come to them. But what neither Franz nor Joseph knew was that they were just two of hundreds of German soldiers lying in wait. And beknownst to the Allies, the Ardennes forest had become a minefield, with more than 100,000 German troops ready to strike. Before the first shots were fired, the Allies had already walked straight into a trap. As the men advanced, the trees grew thicker and the paths narrower, making it easier for the defenders to pick them off one by one. Then came the first attack. A lone German soldier poked his head out from behind a tree and fired. Startled, the Americans responded with a volley of bullets, killing the man instantly. Suddenly, more enemy soldiers emerged from the trees, firing their rifles. Trapped between the forest and a large open field, the Americans were in grave danger. One of those fighting desperately to break through was 20-year-old Private First Class Edward Shaver. Fighting alongside his comrades, he helped repel wave after wave of German attacks. But as the hours passed, men's ammunition began to dwindle. At this rate, they wouldn't last much longer. Meanwhile, word spread throughout the forest of the fierce resistance being mounted by the outnumbered Americans. Seeing the desperate situation his troops were in, Colonel Harry Kinnison ordered reinforcements to the front line. One of those called to arms was 19-year-old Private First Class Robert F. McReynolds. Racing towards the front on a jeep, he joined his comrades just in time to take part in the battle. Despite their best efforts, though, neither Shriver nor McReynolds and the other soldiers could hold off the relentless German assaults. By the end of the first day, the Americans had suffered heavy losses. Wounded and exhausted, they clung to the remnants of their positions, desperately hoping for backup to arrive before it was too late. As night fell over the Ardennes forests, a thick fog rolled in, blanketing the landscape in an eerie silence. Visibility dropped to almost zero. Adding to the chaos, shells screamed through the air, detonating around the trapped soldiers. Those who hadn't already had become casualties of the battle. Among them was Captain George R. Scott, his leg shattered by a mortar round. Despite his excruciating pain, he refused to be evacuated until every man under his command had been accounted for. That's how much of a leader he was. But the situation for the Allies was going from bad to worse. Even more enemy soldiers were arriving on the scene, eager to claim the victory that had been so close at hand. The Germans were confident that they had the upper hand. All they needed to do was hold out until morning and the victory would be theirs. However, neither side knew what the next day would bring. As dawn broke over the Ardennes forest on December 17, 1944, the German soldiers looked out over the battlefield, savoring the prospect of a hard-earned victory. But what they didn't know was that the tide of the battle was about to turn. Suddenly, a loud roar echoed through the forest. Emerging from the mist were the 9th and 10th Armored Divisions, along with elements of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. Over the next few hours, these reinforcements relieved the beleaguered American troops, who had fought so bravely during the previous 2 days. With fresh troops on the ground, the Americans were able to stabilize their positions and mount a counterattack. But even as the battle raged on, there were still many questions without answers. Chief among them, where had the German reinforcements come from? And why had they attacked in the first place? It wasn't until later that the full scope of the German plan was revealed. Back at German headquarters, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt had just received a message from Adolf Hitler himself. The Führer was furious about the recent Allied advances and had ordered him to stop them at all costs. Hitler also wanted von Rundstedt to keep the troops in reserve for another planned offensive in the south. But with the Allies pressing hard, von Rundstedt knew he had no choice but to act. So just before dawn on December, he ordered the attack on the American positions in the Ardennes forest. What followed was one of the largest and most ambitious operations of the entire war. Among the most vital components of the German plan was the sneak attack, which allowed them to catch the Allies off guard. Had the Americans been fully prepared, they might have been able to hold off the initial onslaught. But because of the element of surprise, thousands of lives were lost needlessly. But as the battle raged on, it became clear that something was wrong. The Americans were holding out longer than the Germans had anticipated. So Hitler ordered his troops to press their attack, hoping to catch the Americans off guard. As the days passed, the fighting grew more intense. Both sides suffered heavy losses, but neither could claim a decisive victory. But Hitler was not one to accept anything less than total victory. So he ordered his troops to make one final push, a massive all-out assault that would surely break the enemy's defenses and allow the Germans to claim a much-needed victory. And with that, the Battle of the Bulge entered its final phase. On December, the Germans launched their final assault. Wave after wave of soldiers charged across the battlefield, but the Americans were ready for them. Every inch of ground had been fortified, every tree line booby-trapped. The Germans had nowhere to hide. As the hours passed, the German attacks grew weaker and weaker. Finally, at around 5 p.m., the last German soldier fell. The battle was over. In the end, the Germans had failed to achieve their goal. They had hoped to split the Allied forces into and deal a devastating blow to the enemy. But instead, they had achieved the exact opposite. The battle had pushed the Germans back even further and given the Allies the upper hand. But the victory had not come cheap. On December, General George S. Patton Jr. stood surveying the battlefield. Around him lay the bodies of thousands of dead soldiers, both American and German. He felt a deep sense of sadness, knowing that so much death and destruction had been caused by this senseless war. As he looked out over the landscape, he saw something that made him smile. A group of American soldiers helping to bury the dead German soldiers. It was a small gesture, but it symbolized the true meaning of victory. For Patton, it wasn't just about winning the war, it was about winning the hearts and minds of the people. And with that, he knew that the United States had already won the war. Today, we were going to be looking at how the Battle of the Bulge hastened the end of World War II. The Battle of the Bulge is often seen by historians as one of the last major battles of the war. But aside from being a massive battle that took place over a relatively short space of time in December 1944, it was also the final major German offensive and the last major battle on the Western Front. In some senses, then, it marked the effective end of Germany's ability to wage war. And even if we disagree with this assessment, there is no denying that it marked a very significant moment in the closing stages of the conflict. In fact, Hitler hoped that the offensive would actually achieve so much more than just dealing a severe blow to the Allies. He wanted it to bring about the collapse of the Western Allies and allow him to focus his dwindling resources on the Russians in the East. If you want to find out whether or not he achieved this, then please do stay tuned. As always, a quick reminder to like this video, subscribe if you want to expand your knowledge, and hit the bell notification button if you want to be notified every time we upload a new video. This is a small channel, and so your support really does help us to reach more history lovers like yourself. The Western Front had been relatively quiet since the D-Day landings in June 1943. There were still plenty of major operations such as Operation Neptune, Operation Market Garden, and the advance through Italy. But these all involved limited objectives or occurred outside of Germany itself. Even so, these operations exacted a heavy toll on German resources, which included manpower. By 1944, Nazi Germany was suffering from a severe shortage of soldiers. By late 1944, the situation was becoming increasingly desperate. On top of this, many of those that did serve were not true Nazis. Conscripts made up a quarter of the army, and entire divisions were made up of non-German volunteers from occupied territories. Despite this, though, morale was high, and with the war at a stalemate, the Germans were hopeful that they could achieve a breakthrough with one final push. Hitler had been planning this final push for months, aiming to break through the American lines and capture the port of Antwerp. This would cut off vital supply lines to the British and French, allowing him to force them into surrendering and ending the war in the West. Hitler believed that with the Western Allies out of the picture, he would be able to focus on the Soviet threat in the East and drive them back. The biggest problem he faced was the lack of troops. But he planned to overcome this issue by throwing all available tanks and men at the Allies in one massive surprise attack. It would be carried out into parts. The first would see the bulk of the German forces strike through the Ardennes forest in Belgium. This would hopefully catch the Allies by surprise and allow them to advance quickly before they could regroup their forces. The second part of the plan would involve sweeping through France and into northern Italy. This would effectively split the Western Allies into two separate commands, leading to a collapse in their lines. Even if we disagree with Hitler's assessment of his army's capabilities, it cannot be denied that the Germans did carry out the largest and most ambitious battle of the war on December 16, 1944. Over 12,000 men attacked across a 70-mile front, supported by over 2,000 tanks. They managed to punch a hole in the Allied lines, and by January, they had advanced 50 miles. This offensive became known as the Battle of the Bulge. The battle raged for a month and proved to be a costly affair for both sides. In the end, the Germans suffered over 100,000 casualties and failed to make any further progress. It soon became clear that Hitler's final gamble had failed. But why did the Battle of the Bulge hasten the end of the war? First of all, the offensive exhausted whatever was left of Germany's military resources. Even though the Germans did manage to punch a hole in the Allied lines, they ultimately failed to advance beyond a few small areas. The offensive involved over 12 divisions, around a third of the total strength of the German army. While many of these units were composed of inexperienced and poorly trained conscripts and foreign volume and tiers. The German leadership knew that this was their last chance to win the war. Everything was committed to achieving success. Furthermore, when the offensive failed, these same divisions were then forced to defend these newly captured positions against larger, better trained and better equipped American and Canadian divisions. And while this defense prevented the Allies from advancing further, it meant that once again, these valuable German units were tied down and unable to be deployed elsewhere. Secondly, although the battle failed, the Germans did succeed in causing severe problems for the Allies. As we mentioned earlier, the Germans managed to punch a hole in the Allied lines. And because of this, the Allies were forced to commit large numbers of troops to defending key points along the front. As well as committing more troops to the defense, the Allies were forced to divert supplies away from other areas in order to reinforce the front. All of this placed an additional strain on the already stretched American logistics and supply system. And this would have an effect on other fronts. For example, in the Pacific, General MacArthur was forced to rely on American supply ships to keep his troops supplied, which caused shortages in other areas. Finally, the Battle of the Bulge forced the Allies to cooperate in a way that they had not done before. The Americans were forced to work closely with the British and Canadians in order to repel the German attack. And this cooperation helped to forge an even stronger alliance between the three countries. Just a year earlier, the American commander, General Omar Bradley, had refused to participate in Operation Market Garden, which was a joint operation between Britain and the Netherlands. His refusal was based on the idea that the United States should not fight and die for the Dutch. But the Battle of the Bulge showed him the value of close cooperation and coordination between the Allies. It also showed him that the German army was far more capable than he had given them credit for. So when the Germans launched the Ardennes counteroffensive, Bradley was fully committed to repelling it. He even flew over the front to meet with the commanders of the British and Canadian divisions to coordinate the defense. And this close cooperation between the Allies would only increase in the following years. While the Battle of the Bulge did not end the war, it was a critical moment in the conflict. It was the last major battle fought by the German army, and it marked the end of Germany's ability to wage war. It also forced the Allies to cooperate in a way that they had not done before, and it showed them the value of close coordination between different military forces. It is perhaps not too much to say that without the lessons learned at the Bulge, the Allies may not have been able to successfully liberate Western Europe and defeat the Germans. What do you think? How important do you think that the Battle of the Bulge was in hastening the end of the war? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. And while you're down there, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. On December 16, 1944, an estimated 200,000 German soldiers launched one of the largest and most ambitious operations of World War II, the Battle of the Bulge. Named after the massive bulge that formed in the Allied lines as German forces advanced, this battle was indeed the largest fought by American forces during World War II. But how did this happen? And why did it become the deadliest battle in American history? Before we answer these questions, let me ask you another. What is the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear about the Battle of the Bulge? Is it the freezing cold weather? The desperate fight for survival against impossible odds? Or perhaps visions of snow-covered Ardennes forest with German tanks and men charging through them? If that's the case, then someone did their job well. This famous battle is often depicted like that, even though the reality was somewhat different. The first and biggest misconception about the battle is the weather. Yes, it was cold, but not extremely so. On December, the temperature in the region peaked at 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Only at night did it drop below freezing. And while some units were caught without proper clothing, most American soldiers were prepared for the winter. But why was it still such a horrible experience? That's because of the snow, or rather the lack of it. It didn't snow much during the battle, which meant that a light covering froze quickly and then turned into a thick sheet of ice. This made movement difficult, especially for vehicles. The Germans initially broke through the Allied lines because they attacked before the enemy could prepare their defenses. But as soon as the weather cleared, the Americans could reinforce the front lines. And then the Germans found themselves stuck in the mud. But the real reason the Battle of the Bulge became America's bloodiest battle wasn't the weather or the terrain. It was the enemy. You see, the Germans had good reason to take the offensive. Their defeat at the Battle of Normandy in June 1943 left the Western Front relatively quiet. For over a year, both sides settled into a defensive routine. The Germans knew that the war would be lost if the Allies managed to cross the Rhine River and enter Germany from the west. So they needed to do something big to stop them. Operation Watch on the Rhine, better known as the Battle of the Bulge, was their best chance. The plan was to punch through the thinly defended center of the Allied line, capture the strategically important city of Antwerp, and disrupt supply lines to the west. The Allied Supreme Commander, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, had around 80 divisions under his command. At the same time, he expected to face no more than 6 German divisions in his sector. In reality, the Germans massed more than 3 times as many troops, 20 divisions in total, hiding in the forested area east of the Meuse River. Also, contrary to what the name suggests, the Battle of the Bulge wasn't only fought in Belgium and Luxembourg. German forces penetrated deepest into the United States. The fighting spread all across southern Belgium, eastern France, Luxembourg, and even parts of Germany. But how did the Germans manage to achieve this? To answer that question, we need to look at the state of the American army in late 1944. The U.S. had already been fighting in Europe for more than 2 years, longer than any previous American war. The majority of the troops were tired and wanted to go home. It got worse in November when the hot and rainy climate of Britain was swapped for the cold and dreary winter of northeastern France. Add to that the fact that senior commanders regularly rotated between the front and rear, and you get an army with low morale and little cohesion. As bad as things were, it could have been much worse. There were simply not enough German troops to achieve their objectives. Over the last few months, Hitler had transferred more than 50 divisions from the Eastern Front to the West. But even that wasn't enough. The Germans lacked vital supplies, equipment, food and ammunition. Also, Hitler's insistence on keeping casualties to a minimum restricted German commanders from using all available resources. As a result, when the attack started, several divisions were woefully unprepared. Many had less than half the rifles needed. Others didn't have enough trucks to transport their soldiers. Some even ran out of gasoline within hours. But despite being handicapped, the Germans achieved surprise and broke through the front. Within days, more than 50,000 Americans were surrounded. So why did the Germans lose? Despite having superior numbers, attacking first and catching the Americans by surprise, there are several reasons why the Germans failed to achieve victory. First, the U.S. had superior firepower. A single well-placed machine gun could hold off a German assault for hours. Second, the Germans were hampered by poor planning and a lack of supplies. You can't feed, clothe, equip and wage war with half rations. Third, American determination should not be underestimated. As the battle dragged on, the defenders grew in confidence and inflicted heavy casualties on their attackers. Lastly, once the German spearhead was blunted, there was no relief in sight. As soon as the weather permitted, Allied air power devastated German positions, preventing any large-scale reinforcements or resupply runs. With limited options left, the Germans fell back to their original positions, hoping to renew the offensive at a later date. But that never happened. The Battle of the Bulge lasted 40 days. By then, somewhere between 70 and 85,000 Americans were casualties, making it the deadliest battle in American history. But while 50,000 men were missing in action, most of them returned after the fighting ended. Only around 19,000 were dead. For the Germans, the casualties were even higher, roughly 80,000 men. As far as battles go, it was a tactical success for the Allies and a strategic victory for the Germans. Why? Because even though they lost many men, the Germans managed to tie up a huge number of American troops who would otherwise be involved in the upcoming liberation of Germany. Also, Hitler managed to convince the world that the Germans were still strong and capable of taking the offensive, which encouraged potential allies to stay out of the conflict. In retrospect, it is easy to see why the Germans failed. They simply had too few troops, poorly trained and equipped. But at the time, things looked very different. In fact, the situation was so dire that even General WWII Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, thought the center might collapse. Fortunately for the Allies, the Germans wasted their chance. If the Germans had captured Antwerp, the Allies would indeed have lost valuable time and resources trying to secure the city and its surrounding areas. At the very least, this would have prolonged the war by several months. In the best-case scenario, the Germans could have held out long enough for the war to end. But even if the Allies pushed on towards Berlin, the Germans could have kept fighting in the west until Soviet troops entered the city. In that case, there would have been at least 2 victors instead of 1. The fact that the Battle of the Bulge is now seen as a minor footnote in World War II history rather than a major turning point speaks volumes about the German leadership. First, they attacked with an army that was half-equipped and half-trained. Second, they failed to press their advantage after breaking through the lines. And third, they couldn't capitalize on the resulting confusion to achieve their strategic goals. There is one more thing worth mentioning, the myth of the heroic defense of Bastogne. While it is true that the 101st Airborne Division held out against overwhelming odds, the city itself was never in danger of being captured. In fact, German units didn't even enter the town. They were stopped by elements of the 10th Armored Division south of the city. While the 101st was holding out, elements of the 3rd, 4th and 11th Armored Divisions relieved Bastogne from the south and west. In other words, the relief force arrived before the defenders were in any real danger. This concludes our story about the Battle of the Bulge. But we would like to know what you think about it. Why do you think the Germans lost? Did you know about the Battle of the Bulge? And if so, what do you know about it? Leave your thoughts in the comments section. Also, check out our previous videos about famous events in military history. Thank you for watching.